show 1 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Dinette-Claw with the Intertribal Agriculture Council. I am the Technical Assistant Specialist for the Navajo region. On board with us, we also have Latasha Redhouse, who's our Director of American Indian Foods. That's its own program uniquely within the IAC. And we have our special guests with us, who are Blake Jackson and Carli Hotvet, who both work for our friends there at IFAI, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. And if you joined us last week, we were talking with Chris Roper and visiting about all the considerations for building a meat processing facility. And we had tons of great questions rolling in that has alluded to the webinar that we're hosting today, which are all the regulatory considerations with regards to food safety and everything else in between. So that's what we're here for today. Of course, we only have an hour's time. We're not going to cover everything in an hour, but like Blake and Carli will expand on, this is to arm you with information that you need to get the conversation started with our friends here at IFAI, so you can have an informed and educated conversation moving forward with your plans to expend your valuable CARES Act funding on things like a meat processing plant. So in the future, we will be covering another topic related, which is to mobile processing plants, and from there, all sorts of other things within this IAC CARES webinar series. So any other information that I need to provide, of course, our website, check us out on our website, www.indianag.org. We also have our Facebook. Just go to Facebook and search Intertribal Agriculture Council. Stay up to date with us on all the latest and greatest there. And of course, on the website, you can subscribe to our online newsletters, the Resiliency and Action stories, tons of information we're putting out here on a consistent basis. And of course, my hat's off to each and every single one of you for joining us today. So without any further ado, let's turn the conversation over to Blake and Carli, where they will lead us through this wonderful presentation. Blake, Carli, floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Blake, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first, and then I'll take over and we'll start from there?
Yeah, sure. Halito, Blake Jackson Sahochafo, Chata Sehoke. Hi, everybody. My name is Blake Jackson. I am a staff attorney and policy officer at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas. I originally hail from Southeast Oklahoma, where I grew up and had experience with agriculture projects growing up, and specialized in Native American law at the University of Oklahoma. And now I'm at the University of Arkansas Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and proud to be here with you guys today.
Thanks, Blake. Osio Nagata, Carli Hotvet, Dagodo, Chichalagi, Tulsa, Muskogee Creek Reservation, Jigega. Hi, everyone. My name is Carli Hotvet. I'm Cherokee, and I am from Tulsa on the Muskogee Creek Reservation here in Oklahoma. We had a big old McGirt case decision come out, so we're excited to be recognized as living on our reservations here in Eastern Oklahoma. I am the Director of Tribal Enterprise here with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. I'm an attorney. I have a master's degree in public administration and have been working in tribal spheres for the last almost 5.5 years. And looking to expand development opportunity and agriculture enterprise for tribal governments and individual producers and entrepreneurs, and help scale that up, put you all in touch with the resources that you need to be successful in securing your own food sovereignty and food security. So that's a little bit about me, and we are excited for the opportunity to work with IAC and share information about how to make systemic food improvement in Indian country. And with that, we'll kick off. So our webinar today is going to focus on building a meat processing plant and the regulatory considerations that come along with that. And our intent is to provide you with kind of a foundational knowledge of what opportunities exist and give you the opportunity to learn about what resources exist, how to access those on your own. And so as you're navigating the system about how to put together a meat processing facility, you already have some knowledge about what the questions need to be and what some of the answers that you're looking for, how to source them and how to make that determination. So, excuse me, my dogs are loose in the house right now, so you may hear some barking going on, but we'll just work through that. So on our agenda today, we're going to tell you a little bit about IFAI, give you some data overview about the state of tribal agriculture currently, and then we'll dip into our model code framework. After that, I'll turn it over to Blake to talk about regulatory considerations, and then we will both be available for questions and answers. So we'll go ahead and hit that next slide. So a little bit about us. We're here at the University of Arkansas, established by the School of Law in 2013. Moved with Vice Chancellor Leeds, who helped get us going with Janie Sims Hip. Stacy Leeds was previously the Dean of the law school, and most recently served as the Vice Chancellor of Economic Development. When she moved from the law school to the ED department, we followed her. She has retired from her position as Vice Chancellor and is now Professor Emeritus at the School of Law, and our office recently moved back under the School of Law umbrella, so we're excited to be there and have some really cool plans upcoming, so keep an eye on the work that we're doing. Our mission is to enhance health and wellness in tribal communities by advancing these healthy food systems, by diversified economic development, and supporting cultural food traditions in Indian country. And I'm excited to see these conversations about meat processing plants come along, because feeding our people is one of the most important things that we can do, and bringing those value-added dollars back to our tribal food economies is incredibly important. So next slide. We like to put the tribal sovereignty in food sovereignty by providing strategic legal analysis, policy research, and educational resources to empower Indian country through that food sovereignty, agriculture, and ED, as we talked about. And what that means for you is that we're intended to be a resource. Reach out to us if you have questions. We can help point you in the right direction. We can do deep dives in specific areas with you. We're here to help. So that's what we're hoping to get done today. Next. So a little bit about where we're at. We've seen a $3.5 billion increase as of the last ag census, and that's performed every 5 years. And that $3.5 billion increase is specific to American Indian and Alaska Native producers. So we've seen some pretty phenomenal growth, just over 9% in 5 years. And I would expect to see some similar increases from the 2017 census to the next iteration of the census, and identifying and disclosing who our American Indian and Alaska Native producers are, and encouraging participation with that NASS survey. It's the National Ag Statistical Survey about ag products. We love to see our producers participate in that so we can get accurate counts. And we've seen the increase in market value of livestock and poultry related products increase from 15% from 2012 to 2017. With these meat processing facilities that we see coming on board, there's no reason why we can't duplicate or even increase that percentage. So tribal economies are seeing a lot of operations in current existence with regard to livestock and poultry and related products, and there's no reason why we can't significantly expand that capacity and bring additional dollars back to Indian country. Next slide. So those dollars bringing back to Indian country, right now, a lot of our producers are just operating within that initial production stage. So you think about, production, and then processing, and then, packaging, marketing, warehouse, retail, on from there when we think about our food system. So every step in that gain, there comes a value add. So that product that you're putting out receives additional treatment, either through processing, through packaging, through retail product development, that brings additional dollars to that particular product. So we're looking at this dollar, the farm products alone, that's about 7.8 cents of every dollar that's spent in agricultural industry. If we're able to add food processing onto that, which would be these meat processing facilities, that is almost a 200% increase that we see. So when we get to that second step, and that third step for packaging and transportation, we would see almost triple of our reservation economies based on that. So we have a lot of potential to bring a lot more dollars back to Indian country based on that. So next slide. Our intent is to help out with the legal and regulatory framework. IAC does an excellent job covering the operational aspects and development of these enterprises. We still need some help navigating a lot of these legal and regulatory structures. So in order to help out with that, one of the things that IFAI, under the direction of Janie Sims-Hip when she was director, putting together this model tribal food and ag code to serve as a resource for tribal governments to put together this comprehensive set of model laws that is intended to be a framework and allow for adaptations necessary to specific tribal governments to meet the priorities that each one sees as important. And we had a lot of contributing attorneys that worked on this, and it's intended to promote food sovereignty by facilitating those productions, the food systems development, and those health outcome improvements. So we're going to talk a little bit about that code next. The most important consideration that we have in adopting a code specific to food and agriculture in a tribal economy is to promote and preserve that tribal sovereignty. We can't be truly sovereign until we can feed our people. And so taking the steps necessary to lay that foundation and build from where we're at to get to where we need to be. This model code is intended to be a tool to help get there. Like I said, tribes can set their own preferences, their own standards, their own priorities about regulation and rulemaking, and can tier in and enter into that space as quickly or as narrowly or as broadly or as structured as they want. So it's intended to be flexible to meet the demands and needs of each tribe. It also prevents encroachment on tribal sovereignty. If you have a law on the books and you're operating under that in that regulatory space, it prevents state government encroachment, it prevents federal government encroachment, and allows you to have authority and control and to set the standards that are specific to the preferences of your tribe. And it really empowers your tribe and your tribal citizens in that decision-making and self-determination process. Next slide. So we had a lot of help with this code development. Shout out to Shakopee for helping us out with that, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Mazone, the Agua Fund, Farm Credit, and Nova Foundation, in addition to the IFAI attorneys that worked on this. Our partners with Intertribal Ag Council, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, the Public Health Law Center, and lots of tribal governments that allowed us to go through their codes and use them for examples and models to build this comprehensive model tribal food code. First year was ground truthing and community discussion with roundtable sessions. Years 2 and 3 was a lot of research, drafting, and revision. And in December of 2018, the code was released. And that's available at www.tribalfoodcode.com. Next slide. So we have a lot of different chapters. This is an overview of what's included to date. As you can see, it can walk you through how to develop a tribal Department of Agriculture. There are opportunities to discuss health and nutrition, animals and livestock, land use, water, conservation. We've really tried to do a deep dive on anything where agriculture would be at issue or touch on and the need for development. And we will have also included a section for meat processing under Chapter 5, which is the slaughter of animals and the sale of meat. Next slide. Like we said, you can access the Tribal Food Code on our website. You will have to create a free account by clicking the button next to sign up for access here on the webpage. And I took some screenshots so we can take a look at that. We like to keep that information protected. There's tribal knowledge included in that. And by preventing it from being previewed, we're able to ensure the security and not preview any sort of information to entities that would seek to exploit that. So that's why there's a security there, and you do have to create a login to access that. You can view it in the entirety, or you can download it by section, and you can also search by keywords in that. Next slide. So this is what the landing page looks like when you go to the website, and at the top you'll see sign up on the top right hand corner. You'll click that link and then either log in if you already have established a login, or sign up for access. And there's usually a pretty quick turnaround by getting that approval done. So next slide. You'll come up here and you can scroll down, or this is the top of it. So Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code. And as you click through the green words, those are links, and it'll pull you up to that specific section so you can do that. You can also scroll through. This is the index. Scroll through, and if there's a particular topic you're interested in, you can click on that and it'll expand from there. So next slide. Specific to our Model Tribal Food Code, I've screenshot a couple of the sections with regard to animal slaughter. So Chapter 5 is the slaughter of animals and the sale of meat. And you'll see, you know, we start out with the slaughter of animals and livestock. We have a definition section, slaughter and offer for sale, requirements of license, pre-slaughter brand inspections, seizures of livestock, and quarantine. And so we really go into that pretty significantly. But before, you know, just tossing that code out, we give an overview so you can see that, you know, kind of what the background is and what the need for the code is, and also provide tribal code examples. Those are by tribes who have already done some work in the area, and we pulled that to show, you know, some different examples of what your tribe may be interested in doing. And then we get into the model code language. The model code language have references to different sections that are applicable, and especially when we're talking about putting ag products into commerce, a lot of times if you're going to cross any state line, federal oversight has to be considered because of the interstate commerce implications that come along with that. But we really try and give a pretty good overview. I'm not going to go through every section. I'm just going to give you a highlight. You know, we talk about licensures, we talk about pre-slaughter brand inspections, who's exempt, how your livestock officer inspector might seize livestock if they're non-compliant or if somebody sneaks something through that they shouldn't be, how to deal with quarantine, humane slaughter implications, and then of interest to a lot of people, we also have a section on mobile slaughter. So that I would definitely encourage you to check that out and get logged in for that. We also have some state law examples about you know, just to get an idea of how the area operates, you know, maybe where your tribe's located, to get an idea of, you know, what practices may or may not be consistent with what the state's doing, because we know if we do something new or novel, sometimes there's a lot of pushback without, you know, fundamental understanding. People like to take the perspective of, oh, we've always done it this way, and they expect tribes to be compliant with that just because that's what they're comfortable with, but that's not necessarily something that we should do just to be accommodating. We need to make sure that we're putting our tribal priorities first, and you know, exploring our examples, exploring our opportunities, and setting our own priorities for what's important for us, while keeping in mind that some compliance requirements are going to be mandatory or definitely recommended for ease of entry to that market and for economic success. Next slide. Like I talked about, this is kind of how the model language is laid out. So the title's left blank. So wherever you need to put it in your tribe's code, it can be adopted or adapted as needed. Next slide. So we kind of talked about, you know, some of the different ways that different codes are structured and things that we need to talk about as far as decision making and what parts of the code you may or may not want to incorporate. And there's a lot of questions to be answered for your meat processing facility. Where's it located at? Is it on reservation and trust land? Is it on reservation but on fee land? Is it off reservation on fee land? There are some different implications from the regulatory structure that Blake will do a deeper dive into as we move along. Also think about what the goal of your operation is. Are you strictly service driven? Is this intended to be like a vertical integration? Say your tribe has a large beef herd and you want to solely process what your tribe produces. There's some options there that may be more workable for you than an operation that's maybe more revenue driven, like you want to provide this opportunity for your local beef producers to use your facility so that, you know, you can create jobs and you can see revenue that's coming off of that to sustain that enterprise and also be returned to your tribe for further investment. Or maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe it's self-service plus. Maybe you have your own herd, you want to do some processing for your tribe's herd, you want to do some processing for your tribal producers that are on or near your reservation area, but you also want to do some custom processing and, you know, capitalize on other, you know, that other people's money that always helps us to bring additional revenue in. So there's some considerations there. Those considerations will determine what your inspection needs are. You know, do you intend to enter that product into interstate commerce, which would warrant a federal inspection? Are you going to limit that to just operating within the state where your tribe is located? That may or may not work for some tribes, especially if you're crossing state lines. So what kind of intrastate commerce inspections are available? Or maybe you want to do it yourself and figure out how you can do a novel tribal inspection. There's some considerations under the Farm Bill for that, but at that, you know, Blake will talk more about that. Let's hit the next slide. If you're going to be doing that value-added further processing, even beyond, you know, just slaughter and your basic meat cuts, like maybe you want to do packaging and labeling or smoking or, you know, custom blends or seasonings or custom cuts, that's going to trigger some food safety needs. So there's compliance considerations with that, regulations and inspections. But that doesn't mean that you can't. And certainly, you know, the more value add that you're able to offer, the more dollar opportunities that you have to recapture and return to your tribe and tribal economy. So we're excited to kind of get into the regulatory process. And at that, I will turn it over to Blake to give us info.
Thank you, Carli. So Carli's done a really great job of introducing our framework that we've outlaid for tribes to adopt in their own right if they would like to do some sort of law in the books. But, you know, a lot of the questions we've been getting, part of our role is we're, you know, as Carli said, a resource for tribes that want assistance in these areas, right? And so we've been getting a lot of calls asking, you know, we just want to get going, you know, what kind of code do we need? So I'm going to walk you guys through some of the considerations you might want to take if you're looking at a first stab at this and trying just to get the ball rolling, and maybe some of the gaps in the regulation are with what you might want to fill in with your own tribal code or something you want to do later, or if you want to do this first. But the ultimate, the turnkey issue here that I would probably highlight is you're going to have to figure out under what inspection authority that you want to operate. And if you go back to the previous slide, we talked about interstate. So if you're shipping over state lines or selling your product over state lines, that's what we call interstate commerce. Intrastate commerce means entirely within the borders of a state, even if your reservation is confined to one particular state, or if your reservation might be split in half between two states, that would mean you can only conduct, you know, business within that half of the reservation that's in the state that you're licensed in. And then we talk about a little bit about tribal inspection authorities. I'll get into that in a second, but first of all, I want to talk to you guys about federal inspection authorities and why this might be a good consideration. So federal inspection authorities are the primary goal of a lot of places. The authority is primarily at USDA Food Safety Inspection Service. FSIS is the agency charged with that, and it gets its authority through a variety of federal statutes. The Federal Meat Inspection Act is basically for all of your livestock. So think about your four-leggeds here. Your Poultry Products Inspection Act is more for any kind of avian variety that is covered under the act, and then Egg Products Inspection Act deals with some of the egg inspection authorities that really just kind of highlight the variety here. But everything that doesn't fall within these authorities by default under federal law goes to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So in dealing with processing, a lot of times you're going to be looking more so at the federal side of things with USDA. Now, the thing about federal inspection is that they will house a meat inspector that is a federal employee within your facilities. And so what that means is that you have someone there full-time that you have to give an office space to, and it is a mandatory inspection. So anything that is mandatorily charged with being investigated in terms of these acts, your meat processing federal inspector will go through and do it at taxpayer expense, and that covers all amenable species. So primarily what we're talking about with the context of this audience is going to be the Federal Meat Inspection Act. So that includes your cattle, sheep, swine, goats, horses, mules, and other equines. Those are what we call amenable species under the act. But also under the Poultry Products Inspection Act, I did want to put a smaller flag here to the kinds of things that you can expect to be inspected by a federal inspector as well. So if you have, for instance, an operation that you want to do, say, cattle processing and, sheep and swine processing. Those are amenable species, right? But say, for instance, you want to go and incorporate more traditional foods into your diet. A lot of inquiries that we've been getting are, what about bison? What about domesticated deer? What about, deer at large? And so this is where we kind of split hairs in the regulatory framework, because notice that those are not amenable species under the definition that I just said. You have to look at this in the definition of non-amenable species, which means that they don't fall under that mandatory inspection authority. So if you get inspections here done of these species, USDA will do them. They have the authority to do that, but it's going to be a voluntary inspection. So any inspection of carcasses of these species, bison, domesticated rabbits, domesticated deer, pheasant, quail, and captive raised waterfowl, that is going to be done as a voluntary service by that same inspector, but it'll be done at cost. Now, we get into the regulatory considerations of how do you want to pay for this and how do you want to pay for those services. Again, this is where you have some leeway in the interpretation of how you want to assert your sovereignty in this regard. If it's something that you want to do from tribal revenues, that's entirely optional. You can also implement some sort of fee structure for this and charge a certain fee per head. So just know that there is going to be a compensation needed for that meat inspector's time. And again, like I said, it is going to be a continuous inspection by the federal inspector that's officed full-time at your processing plant. And as part of that, they have to have their own license, their own office space to make sure that everything's complying with federal law, and that these carcasses are being done in a way that's both safe, and the animals prior to slaughter are being done in a humane way that comports with federal law. It is worth noting here, though, that they are federal employees. So, the question is, what about tribal employment policies applying to them? They are not tribal employees. So that is one thing to note as well. The other thing too is that they have to be there at any time that you are conducting operations and processing any of the amenable species and the non-amenable species that you apply to USDA to get that grant of authority for inspection from. So that is our federal inspection. That is the big one. The second authority that we'll look at is state inspection. Now, federal inspection is required for products sold in intrastate commerce, meaning that if you are selling something entirely within the state, right, you still have to have a federal inspection unless your state goes through a program known as the State Meat and Poultry Inspection Program. There's 27 states listed on the USDA website that are currently licensed to conduct these programs. But the thing is that any states that want to take on this authority, they have to make sure that their standards are at least equal to those under federal law. So basically your state Department of Agriculture would have to call USDA, Food Safety Inspection Service, show them their standards. They'd have to be evaluated against federal standards to make sure that they're at least equal to. They can be more strict than federal law, but if they're lesser than federal law affords them those protections and those requirements, then it's not going to pass those that authority for application. But USDA does evaluate these programs annually. But the thing to note here is that you can only, even if you get that state inspection authority, your products are limited to sell within the state of the inspection, unless USDA has opted into a cooperative interstate shipment program with your state. That's an extra authority that they can get. And what this basically means is that those state inspected facilities basically operate just at the same level that federal ones do. And you can ship your product externally, meaning you could ship it across state lines. And this is something to think about if you're wanting to go the state route and your state's opted to be one of those states. You can think of this in terms of export authority. If you wanted to export your product and you want to sell it online, that's a consideration for economic development. If you want to go the state inspection route and your state's gone and done not only the application process for state meat and poultry inspection, the MPI program, but also opted into that cooperative interstate shipment program. Now, some of the considerations with this, there's always the question of sovereignty and asserting your own sovereignty, and to the exclusion of state authority within the reservation. And so a lot of people that are asking, about this and looking at those considerations are looking at that federal inspection authority to safeguard that. I will say though that there are some exemptions under federal law if you are looking to go with the slaughtering facility route. 3 exemptions are: the first is the personal and individual use. So this is basically if you have livestock that you want to slaughter yourself for your own family, for your own consumption, for any guests that you have, basically non-paying guests. So you can't do it in terms of if you have like a hotel, you can't serve the product there, but if you had people over for dinner, it's kind of what that's referring to. You can go ahead and do that and claim an individual use exemption, and you don't have to go through the requirements of federal inspection or any kind of inspection of that matter. You can also apply for a custom exemption. So this is basically when someone comes to you and say, example would be if Carli and I partnered together and we said we wanted to go put in our money to get a steer processed, right? And we put it to a commercial operation. Basically, this is where that operation slaughters for the consumer and gives the product back to them. And there is no, they're not taking the meat from that animal and putting it on the commercial market. So that's what we can get a custom exemption under. You're not subject to continuous inspection requirements, but all food safety laws dealing with adulteration of the product, misbranding the product, and making sure you're keeping records to make sure that you're not doing those things under federal law. There still are some federal requirements at the backdrop of that. And lastly, not really an exemption, but more of an exclusion from this statute. And these statutory authorities are retail stores. So this is basically when you go to your local grocery store and they have, a butcher counter. They might have, larger cuts of meat that they may cut up into smaller steaks for you. But they have to be selling to household consumers as their primary target. If they sell to, hotels, restaurants, any other businesses, they can't exceed more than 25% of that sell, because if their market share goes to more than 25% of those non-household consumer customers, then they fall under the federal inspection authorities. So those are that's the lay of the land. But that's a good preface for our discussion in terms of the determinations that are going to kind of influence your regulatory oversight. So basically, this is the question you're going to have to ask, and it's going to be dispositive of a lot of different things of who is involved and how broad is your operations coverage. It's going to really determine on where the regulatory gaps are covered under federal, maybe state law in some instances, whether or not you are a tribally owned operation and you want to assert tribal law. So kind of looking at this from a turnkey point of tribally owned operations, your location is going to turn on basically where you're at, because under federal law, if you're on tribal land, trust land, or, anything within your reservation that your tribe would normally have jurisdiction over under federal law, tribal law is going to govern, and sometimes federal law, depending on what area of law you're dealing with here. But, location is going to be determinative. Now, if you're operating maybe a facility that your tribe's acquired, or maybe you have some fee land just outside of your reservation, you're going to be subject to whatever state law there might be, because basically as a tribal entity, once you're outside of that sovereign capacity on your own land, federal law provides that, tribal citizens are subject to the regulatory scheme of the states, just like anyone else is. So that's kind of where some more of that conversation of getting federal inspection authority may be a little bit more relevant to that. Looking at your scope of operation, what kind of animals are you looking to process? Are you looking to process, beef cattle, sheep, swine, things of that nature? Or are you looking to get into some of the non-amenable species that we talked about, looking at, domesticated deer, looking at buffalo, looking at that, the scale of your operation, sometimes the economics are going to control what you want to do with regard to the scope of everything above. Interstate commerce with product distribution, if you are a tribe that you've got a really good relationship with your state, and that's something that you really want to go look at doing, it's going to have to be sold entirely within that state. But if you go with a federal route, you're also going to have to deal with interstate commerce being the benefit there. So you're going to get more protection for shipping your product to a wider array of markets for economic development and revenue generation if you go the federal route, unless your state's opted into those interstate cooperative authorities, which only 7 states have done that. And in my review of that, not many of them had tribal populations. So federal is probably the route you're going to want to look at, and the tribes that we've talked to are interested in doing that. Now, Carly alluded to this in her discussion. We have a lack of parity for tribal inspections. And essentially what that means is under the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act and the Egg Products Inspection Act, all those, that cadre of federal law that I just talked about, there are authorities for federal and state inspectors to have weight in the force of federal law and all of that. But there is no provision in there for tribes to have their own inspections done and for those to carry the full weight. So any instance that you would see federal and state in those laws, you don't see a allowance for tribes to be active in that space. So that's when we talk about lack of parity. There might be some movement there, if there was a push in the next farm bill to get that amended. But right now that's kind of the lay of the land, is either going with federal or state. Also pre-slaughter inspections, if you want to step into that and have some sort of tribal law on the books as to how you want to make sure that there's branding, make sure there's certain pieces of tribal code that are being complied with prior to processing that maybe federal or state law would not cover. So you also need to look at privately owned operations. If you're a tribal member wanting to do this, again, land status is going to be determinative of the jurisdiction that you're under. If you're looking at just regular fee lands or trust lands on the reservation, there's a different regulatory scheme that's going to come into effect there. And it's going to determine whether or not you're dealing with tribes and tribal members. If you're dealing with non-members, according to Supreme Court precedent set forth in the Montana case that everyone likes to talk about, dealing with civil regulatory jurisdiction, tribes don't have a lot of civil regulatory authority over non-members unless there's either some sort of commercial relationship or a contractual arrangement with the tribe, or 2, there's some sort of conduct that threatens the political integrity, economic security, and the health and welfare of the tribe or its members. There's not really been much of a pathway in that second way. So any kind of jurisdiction that the tribe would try to assert over a non-member that would have support under federal law would have to be some sort of contractual oversight, even on trust lands or on fee lands. So you're going to look at kind of that backdrop and what kind of regulatory space is going to be in play there. If you're looking at privately owned operations, again, do you have the capacity to take this on? Are you going to have to hire a lot of new employees? If you're doing this just in terms of an entrepreneurial venture for your tribe, are you going to have to send people out for certifications? Do you have the right people in play to make sure this is a sustainable operation? Now, if you're wanting to license some of these individual privately owned operations, again, we talk about mobile slaughter units being a piece of that, possibly if someone wanted to take over the jurisdiction of that on the reservation. You can have some sort of food code, but you can also have some sort of internal policy or regulation that the tribe has been charged with being developed by the legislative body, and making people apply for a license. And then, you can enter some sort of contractual arrangement based upon the signatory of that agreeing to abide by all federal and tribal food safety laws. So that might be a way to get that jurisdiction implemented. And also having independent inspection authority, that could be something under tribal law that you might want to implement where the gaps in federal or state law might not cover. Now, there are additional things to consider. Additional considerations, again, looking at that non-amenable species. You might want to do this in terms of processing those amenable species of, sheep, goats, cattle, swine. That's all good, and you can have that covered by your federal inspector. But if you want to enter into that non-amenable market to, bison, domesticated deer, elk, you're going to have to look and see whether or not you have the resources to do that economically, and whether the appetite is there and it's feasible for you to enter into that space, to doing it on a by head basis. And also you're going to have to deal with, doing a clean line of production. Are you going to shut your facility down? If you have a heavy, traffic of amenable species coming through, say if you have a heavy rotation of beef processing coming through, is it going to be economical to halt production on that, clean everything, and enter, production for bison and lose that that revenue stream from beef cattle that you might have had going through. You know, I talked about deer. Look at domesticated deer is what I talked about. Notice that wild hunted deer are not included as an amenable species. So if you're wanting to do some sort of operation in doing that, you might want to look at a separate facility in terms of maybe a mobile processing unit to kind of flag that for discussion. And again, is the economic feasibility there? You know, is the market saturated? Is there already a processing facility nearby that is going to impact the market share that you're going to have? Is it viable to enter into that right now with where you're at in your tribal government in terms of leadership buying into it, in terms of the local livestock market nearby? What kind of tribal operations and competing resources might need to be considerations? So with that, I would like to kind of go into where we can help and how we can kind of help you with that process going. We can sit down and talk about planning. Our team can do that and the goals that you might have about that. Helping you research funding information in terms of ways that this can be done. I know we've had a lot of discussion of CARES Act funding being implemented in terms of infrastructure for this and promoting food security with all the supply chain disruptions that have been going on. Legislative support in terms of our tribal food code is a good example of what Carli talked about. You know, organizational development. How do you want this to fit into your tribal operation? You know, we could sit down and talk about how this might fit into a larger framework for a tribal department of ag, all with against the backdrop of our staff having, you know, a lot of different experience. You know, Carli and I are both attorneys. We've got attorneys and non-attorneys on staff. We've got people that have worked for the federal government. One of our employees has worked at the Office of Tribal Relations. Carli and I have come from working for our tribes in Oklahoma and having that in-house legal and programmatic experience, and also having, you know, the skills and being able to research those policy opportunities and how those things will impact you guys as they come out. So with that, I did provide some additional resource links for further research if you want to dive into these topics. The first is a link to our model tribal food and ag code that Carli talked about. We have at the USDA FSIS, there's a whole page dedicated to the federal grant of inspection, and it walks you through the process on how to do that. I've included a link to state inspection programs if you're interested in exploring that. There is a resource help desk for small and very small processing plants. Basically, you can get in there and ask USDA any regulatory question you want, and it goes to their team in the Office of Policy and Public Engagement, I believe, at FSIS, and they can give you a straight answer if you would like on those things. You can sign up for a free account for contacting them via phone or email. There's also an Ask USDA part of their website where you can just type in your question and it'll pull up, you know, kind of in an FAQ fashion, like of what already has been answered. And the Congressional Research Service is kind of a think tank and policy research service that is available within the federal government for members of Congress, but occasionally they put out publicly facing research documents for people that just kind of need a background in some of these issues. And I've attached a couple of links to some of their publications on just the federal food safety system, you know, the regulatory pieces behind that, and some of that. I will say that the information here is a little bit dated, but most of it is still good law, but it would give a good overview. So with that, Carli and I's contact information is here at the end. Please feel free to reach out to us via email. I will flag one thing that always happens here. If you email me, it is GBJACKSO, not Jackson, or it'll get kicked back. They only let us have so many characters on our email, and I got cut off before I can put my full name. So keeping in mind of that, if you want to reach out to us, we're available and we can have side conversations as, you know, specific situations arise. But with that, I will turn it back over to the others here for the Q&A part.
Great. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Carli. Very bold, very clear, very concise. We certainly appreciate you putting all this extra time in preparation to get through the entire presentation in only, less than 45 minutes. We're doing really well today. Great job. First question that comes up is from Mr. Buck Jones. He's asking, where does wild game that is harvested by tribal members fit into amenable versus non-amenable, and how is it possible to do wild game in the same processing facility, which I know we were talking about a little bit. Maybe you can dive in on that a little more.
Okay. So kind of going back earlier, like the example, familiar to where Carli and I are from is whitetail deer. Everyone the discussion we've entered into with some of our tribes back home is, if they want to process deer, how do they do that? And, those are hunted game, by tribal members back home. And so it's going to depend on the game, that you're talking about. I'm assuming, deer would be an example that I can kind of think off the top of my head, because we've gotten this question a lot. They're concerned with the sourcing of the animal, right? Because there's no way to verify the integrity of where it's been. Has it been, medicated properly, vaccinated properly? What's the treatment of this animal like? Has it been exposed to pathogens? And so that's why they allow domesticated, but there isn't really a whole lot of leeway for wild game in either of the framework. So again, you can, as a non-amenable species, you can say, well, we have, this cervidae operation where we have 2 fences where, the deer can't, interact with wild deer, and you don't have chronic wasting disease as the concern. There's a lot of protocols in play when you have domesticated animals, but if it's not within those definitions, it doesn't fit within that. And so it'll have to be done. You can probably do it in the same facility. It's just going to really depend on what species you're wanting to do, and what are you going to do with that food inspector's time, because they can't be the ones to inspect that, because that is not within their federal scope of duties. The one thing that we've talked about doing that is, a lot of tribes are looking at maybe getting a mobile processing unit kind of on the same plot of land, so that those 2 lines of production are kept entirely separate. And it's just going to depend on the economics of that too.
Yeah, and I'll add the volume of wild game processing. Obviously, that's going to be variable across different tribal locations, but generally wild game will tend to be fairly seasonal, depending upon your tribe's practices and policies, and also some of the treaty reservations specific to traditional hunting and gathering. But if you were to process within the larger facility, that'd have to be a total and complete shutdown and a refurb, essentially getting that set up to process whatever species that you would be bringing through that would be considered non-amenable. And like Blake said, that federal inspector would not have the authorization to sign off on that. From an economic perspective, it's probably more feasible to do a mobile processing unit for wild game processing, especially since it's likely to be more seasonal. You're probably going to see a lower volume relative to what your amenable species processing is going to look like. So that's kind of the suggestions that we've provided at that point. If you have to shut down your entire line and stop because you can't do multiple species at the same time, if you're interrupting a very lucrative beef processing facility to, process maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 deer or elk, depending upon, what that volume is, you're probably going to see a market loss. So we would definitely encourage, that thought process to go through, but there are solutions available for you to address that.
Great answer. Thank you all so much for that. Another question that came in here, might be our last one. It says, where would a fish hatchery or aquaponics operation where fish are sold fall in terms of processing?
Okay, I can elaborate on that a little bit, because I've encountered that issue with a tribe that we dealt with up in the Northeast. So everything that I talked about for the most part is USDA's jurisdiction. Now you get into a little bit of a gray area in terms of the non-amenable species, because although it's a voluntary inspection by USDA, they technically can still fall under FDA's jurisdiction too. Because basically anything that is not an amenable species falls within, within those laws I talked about. Anything that's not an amenable species technically falls under FDA's jurisdiction. But I will say that FDA is not really heavy-handed in terms of the way they, and including fish. So even though fish is not listed as a non-amenable species, seafood regulation, all of that is subject to FDA requirements. Now, FDA is pretty heavy-handed in terms of what they require for fish operations. That's going to need to be a separate conversation, because that's a very complicated framework to get into. But you're still going to have a HACCP plan. You're still going to have to deal with food safety protocols, but they're entirely different for fish and aquaponics. That's an FDA side of the regulation coin. And if I don't know who this is, it says anonymous attendee, but if you'll feel free to follow up with me via email, I will be happy to point you in the right direction for that. But with the non-amenable species, to kind of go back to the last question, FDA is not really heavy-handed in their asserting of that jurisdiction. It's more done at the local level. FDA has a model food code that local governments have adopted, and that's kind of how they assert that jurisdiction, is through the local side of things. So that's kind of a gap for where tribal regulation can come into play. But with fish, that's an FDA conversation, and we'd have to talk about that in a sidebar.
Perfect. Another one that comes in here from Terry Dahl, which says, besides Quapaw, are there any other active tribal processing plants?
There's one up north, isn't there, Blake?
I am not sure about that. Quapaw is the one that I know of.
Yeah, we do have educational facilities here on Navajo Nation. There's one I know that's certainly active at the moment. We're able to get them funding and keep them rolling, but it is an educational facility and not quite for churning out product for retail. But that's what I have in mind there. Any other questions before we wrap up? We do promise to stay until the last question is answered. We just have a comment here from Mr. Buck Jones again, thanking you, Carli, for mentioning the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission in the Model Food Code section. So thank you for that kind comment. And if there are not any further questions, we want to extend our thank yous once again to our friends here at IFAI for joining us and continuing the IAC Cares webinar series. Don't forget, I believe it's next week, we will be featuring our building a processing plant for mobile slaughter units. So that's an exciting one you'll not want to miss. And of course, from there, we'll keep building out the series further and further to continue to enhance that the weakest link in the chain when it comes to localized food systems. So beyond that, one more announcement I do have here from our very own Desva Padilla. The IAC Southwest Region Summit will be virtual, and it will be held September 22nd. So what we will do there is we'll have everyone register. We'll go live on Facebook or through another platform, and we'll just turn everyone loose with a bunch of pre-recorded sessions and offer those opportunities for Q&A as well. So, and it's going to be extremely simple, straightforward. We want to make it as easy as possible for everyone to access the information. Be sure to reach out to us for any other considerations or ideas for webinars throughout the series. Don't forget to listen to our podcast, Resiliency Through Agriculture. New episodes going up this week. We have another one going up next week as well. Excited to reveal those to y'all as well. And keep an eye out on our Facebook page for our short film series under the Resiliency Through Agriculture brand. Tons of unique stories I've been capturing out here with the local 4-H youth who are continuing to raise and feed livestock there for virtual shows coming up. So tons of cool stories there to share as well. Hey, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Carli. We'll see you all later.
Thank you.